The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen with Willy Rushton and Toby Longworth. Episode 4, The Toast of the English. Critics of Baron Munchausen of Bodenwede have pointed out that a certain xenophobia, the hint of a haughty distaste for other nationalities, can occasionally be detected in the accounts of this remarkable German adventurer. The French are arrogant, the Dutch are rude, the Americans, could the Baron have had some prescient sense that 2 centuries later the dead-eyed Dr. Myron Bogle would scrutinize his work, the Americans are supremely dull. As the world's leading Munchausen expert, I have no problem with these views. He was, after all, writing in the 18th century when life was different. Times change, and so do people.
Personally, I've always liked the English.
We're back with the Baron in his library at Bodenwede.
A brave, if stupid, and horribly vulgar people, so I was pleased to be able to help them out at the siege of Gibraltar.
Historical footnote. The siege took place in the year of 1704 with the British forces.
Kindly stop your inane drivel, you English buffoon. Not that I intended to become involved in that great battle when I went to see my old friend General Elliot on a social visit. One day the General and I were looking out from the garrison of Gibraltar at the French camp in the distance and discussing, as soldiers will, the best tactics to use. General Elliot turned to me.
And what would you do in my place, Baron?
I reached for the powerful telescope which I always carry with me. "Well, General," I said coolly as I looked through the eyeglass, "whatever you do should be done quickly, because at this very moment the French are preparing to fire a 36-pound cannonball at the spot where we are standing."
Oh, good Lord, Baron, what on earth are we going to do?
I told you the English weren't very bright. "Get your men to bring the biggest cannon in the garrison," I said urgently. "Leave the rest to me." Within seconds, a troop of English soldiers had dragged a mighty 48-pounder into place. It was now that my experience as a shooting man stood me in good stead. I took careful aim, all the while waiting until the French gunners were about to fire the cannon. At that precise moment, I gave our soldiers the order to fire our cannon as well. My plan worked perfectly. Halfway between the two armies, the cannonballs collided with a deafening crash. The enemy's ball, being the lighter of the two, ricocheted back in the direction from which it came, removing the head of the man who fired it. Along with those of no less than 16 soldiers who, as luck would have it, were standing directly behind him. And flew on across an expanse of sea where it broke the masts of 3 Spanish fighting ships, before finally coming to rest on a distant shore, where it fell through the roof of an old labourer's hut and into the gaping mouth of his wife, who was asleep at the time. The labourer then returned, and after mending his roof, pushed the cannonball downward with the help of a broom handle safely into his wife's stomach, where for all I know it still rests. As for our cannonball, it struck the enemy cannon with such force that it fell straight through the bottom of the ship, which sank immediately. There was a smattering of applause from the troops around me.
Yeah, very good.
Tremendously good.
Well done.
Good shot, yes. Superb work, Baron. I would like to award you several campaign medals on the spot.
An offer which naturally I declined. The satisfaction of a job well done was reward in itself. You may have read in the history books of a great fire in the French camp which altered the course of the siege of Gibraltar. The cause of that fire has always been something of a mystery, until now. The English were so kind to me that I decided to help them once more before I continued my travels. One night I disguised myself as a priest, crept out of the garrison and into the enemy camp. I made straight for the French commander's tent, where I found, to my surprise, for it was now 1 o'clock in the morning, that a meeting was in progress. "Bonsoir, monsieur le prêtre," said the Prince d'Artois, completely fooled by my disguise. "Nous discutons de comment il faut attaquer l'armée anglaise demain à l'aube."
Good morning, Mr. Priest. We are discussing how to attack the English at dawn.
I managed somehow to conceal my alarm. The French were going to attack our army the very next morning. I was going to have to move quickly. After the Prince and his generals had retired to bed, I went to work. Fortunately, it was a dark, moonless night, and it's a tradition in the French military that before a big battle, the entire army, including the sentries, should get a good night's sleep, so I was undisturbed. First of all, I dismantled every one of the 300 cannons in the French camp, Then, and this was probably the most exhausting work I've ever done, apart from swimming across the River Simois with a cannon on my head in the presence of the Sultan of Turkey, I threw them, one by one, into the sea. After I'd recovered my breath, I quietly piled the French gun carriages into a great heap in the centre of the camp. By the time I'd finished with them, there was a column of carriages higher than the Rock of Gibraltar. Unfortunately, I had no time to add the mortar weapons to the pile, an omission which I was later to regret. So it was that just before breakfast, I was able to light up the greatest bonfire in the history of modern warfare. In order to avoid suspicion, I was one of the first to raise the alarm. "Oh, succour!" I cried, scurrying about the camp in my priest's robes. "Quelqu'un est en train de brûler nos engins! Quelle horreur!"
Help! Someone is burning our gun carriages. What a horror.
The French acted as they always do in a serious crisis, with panic, confusion, and terror. The Prince d'Artois and his commanders were last seen in their pyjamas, running in the direction of Paris, which they reached in a very respectable time of 14 days. Some say that d'Artois was unable to speak for the rest of his life for fear and shame, but personally I put that down to typical exaggeration on the part of historians. You know how it is when you're a particularly popular guest.
Yes,
You have the devil's own job to get away, don't you? So it was with me. I was still in Gibraltar 2 months later, when fate gave me the chance to help the British Army with one final act of utterly selfless heroism. I was having breakfast one morning with General Elliot, when a mortar shell landed on the table before us. The General quite naturally left the room rather quickly, but I calmly picked up the mortar and carried it firmly but carefully to the top of the Rock of Gibraltar. Far off in the enemy camp, I could see a group of people milling about some sort of scaffolding. I looked through my telescope and saw a sight which chilled me to the bone. 2 British officers, who had just been captured as spies, were standing with ropes round their necks on a high platform. At any moment they would be executed. My problem was this. The enemy camp was too far away for me to be able to throw the mortar with my bare hands. Luckily, I always carry with me a small leather sling. In fact, it's the very sling with which David killed Goliath in the Bible. Taking care not to let my hand shake, I placed the mortar into the sling and hurled it as hard as I could in the direction of the execution party. It was a perfect shot. The shell landed in the midst of the enemy, killing every one of them. As I had anticipated, the 2 officers were saved by the fact that they were standing high above the crowd. The scaffolding toppled to the ground, and the officers, spotting with unusual speed for Englishmen that their executioners were dead, ran to the seashore, stole a rowing boat, and made their way to the nearest friendly ship, where they were given a hero's welcome.
In his predictably dreary contribution to the Professional Soldier magazine, an article which he elected to call Munchausen, a Fantasist Goes to War, Dr. Myron C. Bogle asked, applying the proverbial telescope to his blind eye, as is his habit, why did the alleged mortar on the alleged breakfast table take quite so long to explode? The record can now definitively be set straight. Please, Baron, explain what happened to the mortar for the benefit of my dear friend Dr. Bogle.
The mortar. Explode. Oh, yes. I expect you're wondering about the sling of mine I just mentioned. How on earth, you're thinking to yourself, did the Baron happen to have in his pocket the very sling with which David killed Goliath? Well, it's a long and absolutely true story. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was the wife of Uriah, who, as you will know if you've read your Bible, was extremely friendly with King David. In fact, she was so friendly with him that she bore several of his children. One day she had a terrible quarrel with the king over a very serious question. Where precisely Noah had built his ark, which may not sound very serious to you, but it mattered to people in the Bible. That night, Uriah's wife ran away from the palace, taking with her the king's most valued possession, his sling. 6 of King David's bodyguards set off in pursuit and caught up with her just outside Tiberias. Seeing the men approaching on horseback, Uriah's wife reached for David's sling and let fly a rock, which hit the first of the bodyguards between the eyes. He was dead before he hit the ground. The other men decided that no piece of leather was worth dying for and returned home. Did I mention that Uriah's wife had taken her favourite son with her? When she died, it was he who inherited the sling, which since then has been handed down from father to son until it's reached me. The stories this sling could tell. My great-great-grandfather, who lived some 250 years ago, happened to visit England once and became friends with a young writer, William Shakespeare, I think his name was. This Shakespeare was apparently something of a hunter, and used to borrow the sling to kill deer on Sir Thomas Lucy's estate. One day he was caught, imprisoned, and, if it had not been for a clever plan hatched by my great-great-great-great-grandfather, he would have been hanged as a common thief. It so happened that Queen Elizabeth I, who was on the English throne at the time, had become so tired of life that she could no longer be bothered to do the simplest everyday tasks, dressing, undressing, eating and drinking, having a bath, and other basic necessities of daily life that I'm too shy to mention. So the Queen of England was wasting away from sheer laziness. My great-great-great-grandfather's plan was brilliantly simple. He offered to do all these things for the Queen on condition that she spared Shakespeare's life. Queen Elizabeth agreed and gave him the title of beef-eater, because eating the royal beef was one of his duties.
It is perhaps important to mention at this point that although there are still beef-eaters in London, it is a purely honorary title. No implication is intended in this account that Her Majesty the Queen has employees in funny hats to do everything for her, including dressing, undressing, eating, drinking, having a bath, or any of the basic necessities of daily life, which the Baron was too shy to mention. I just thought we'd set the matter straight.
Shakespeare was released, gave up hunting, and settled down to write a play called Much Ado About Nothing. The title was my great-great-great-grandfather's idea. In fact, it's true to say that if it were not for the Munchausen family, some of the greatest works of English literature would never have been written.
One of my earliest tasks as keeper of the Munchausen archive was to confirm that the young Shakespeare had, amongst his closest friends, a man called Munchausen. Records are sketchy of the time, which may account for the fact that the nearest to the name Munchausen was a Thomas Monmouth, an actor with the Globe Theatre. Did the apprentice playwright change the name Munchausen to Monmouth in an attempt to make his friendship more acceptable to the English court? It seems highly likely.
Many is the time over the years that the sling has saved human lives. My father, who, like me, was a great adventurer, frequently used to tell of one particularly narrow scrape. He was taking a walk on the sands near Harwich, when, quite without warning, he was attacked by a vicious animal known as a sea horse. My father dodged behind a sand dune, and then remembered he had the sling in his pocket. Reaching down for a couple of pebbles, he hurled them at the seahorse, removing both eyes. Father was always rather a good shot, and sticking fast in the eye sockets. Oddly, the creature appeared not to mind having pebbles for eyes, but merely became rather tame and friendly. My father climbed on its back, and using the sling as a makeshift bridle, he rode it into the sea. In less than 3 hours he'd made the crossing to Holland, where he sold the seahorse for the sum of 700 ducats, which just about covered the cost of his return trip to England with a small profit for his pains. So what is it that makes this sling so special? The answer is this: you can do anything you like with it. Last year, for example, I was in London with the sling and enjoyed what I called the Great Frolic. Having made the greatest air balloon in the history of flying, which wasn't nearly as difficult as you might think, I flew over London and played some rather amusing games. One night, I strapped the sling round the roof of a house in Threadneedle Street, and while the people inside were asleep, lifted it carefully off the ground and carried it several miles to a spot just outside Maidenhead. On another occasion, I caused the sentry at Windsor Castle to be severely reprimanded for being drunk while on duty, after he'd claimed that the castle clock had struck 24 times. The luckless infantryman was, of course, quite right. That evening I had carried St. Paul's Cathedral all the way to Windsor Castle. The sound of the 2 great bells striking at midnight was quite impressive. In the end, I decided to return St. Paul's to its rightful place because it was blocking a road. But my favourite frolic of all occurred on the evening of the annual dinner which is held at the College of Physicians and to which every doctor in London is invited. As the guests were settling down to the first of many courses, I floated over the building in my balloon, fastened the sling to the golden ball which is on top of the college roof, and lifted the entire building into the sky above London. I left it hanging there for no less than 3 months. Surely you'll remark those poor doctors must have starved.
What? Oh, yes, Baron. What about the doctors? Did they not starve?
Far from it. There was enough food and drink on the banquet tables to last them a full 6 months, if it had been necessary. In fact, the only effect of suspending London's doctors in the air for 3 months was that people stopped dying from being given the wrong medicine. It was only when the city's gravediggers, undertakers and priests began to complain to me that they would soon be out of a job that I decided to put an end to the Great Frolic and bring the College of Physicians down to earth again.
How time flies by when Baron Munchausen is revealing the extraordinary facts of his life. and how reluctantly we must take our leave of this astonishing man.
But going back to the siege of Gibraltar, you'll remember that I referred to a tremendously powerful apparatus, the most powerful telescope in the world.
Baron, we have to...
It was this instrument that I took with me on my voyage to the Arctic with Captain Phipps, on the occasion that I was actually obliged to become a polar bear. We've been travelling for some 2 months through the vast wastelands.
The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen featured Willy Rushton as the Baron. The editor and all other parts were played by Toby Longworth. The stories were adapted by Terence Blacker and produced by Diane Mathias.